Today we're going to start our cellular energy unit. Now, cellular energy is a cycle. It's a two-part cycle, and each part needs the other one. They feed off of each other, and if one part of the cycle disappears, so will the other part. Now, plants can do both parts of the cycle, which are photosynthesis and respiration. So plants don't need us because they can do it all on their own. But animals can only do one part of the cycle, respiration. So we need plants so that they can do the other half for us. Now, before we can really get into these two different pieces, photosynthesis and respiration, we need to start with a little background information. So that's what today is going to be, just sort of a brief introduction. So let's remind ourselves about energy. Cells use energy to do work. They need energy to build proteins. They need energy to transport stuff into the cell. They need energy to transport stuff out of the cell. They need energy to do absolutely everything that they do. Now, energy is not released all at once, because that would be really wasteful, because you would be releasing a huge amount of energy. So what we're going to do is something called a biochemical pathway. This is where energy is released a little bit at a time. So you start to break down an energy molecule, such as a carbohydrate, and you're going to break it a little bit and release a little bit of energy, and then break it a little bit more and release a little bit more energy, okay? And every step of the way, each of these small steps of energy release is going to require an enzyme. Now, remember, an enzyme is a special protein whose job it is to help reactions occur faster. And remember, there would be no life on Earth without enzymes. So where do organisms get their energy? Well, we can break all organisms into two major groups, autotrophs and heterotrophs. So let's remember from our prefix-suffix list that we studied at the beginning of the year and break these words down. Auto means self-operating, and troph means to eat. So autotrophs make their own food to eat by themselves. Okay, so they're going to produce their own food. So these are going to be your plants. Any type of plant you can think of, it's an autotroph because it can make its own food. The other group of organisms are the heterotrophs. Hetero meaning different, troph meaning to eat. So they have to eat different things. They cannot make their own food. They have to either eat plants who made food, so autotrophs, or they have to eat other animals who have fed on plants at some point. This represents a simple chemical reaction. Okay, on one side, you have your reactants. So a reactant is an ingredient. It's what goes into a reaction. On the other side, we have our products. A product is an outcome. It is what comes at the end of a reaction. So if we wanted to think about this in a simple, everyday way, you can think about chemical reactions occurring in the kitchen. Let's say that I take my reactants, eggs, sugar, milk, and chocolate, and I mix them in a bowl. Okay? Those are my reactants, my ingredients, eggs, milk, sugar, and chocolate. Then I put them in the oven. So I'm going to heat them up, and heating can cause a chemical reaction. After I'm done heating it for, say, an hour, I pull out my product, a chocolate cake. And the chocolate cake is my product. It is different from the reactants. It's made from the reactants, but it has changed its identity because it was a chemical reaction. Now, what you have to be really careful about with chemical reactions and identifying reactants and products is your arrow. Which way is it pointing? The reactants always come before the arrow, and the arrow is always pointing to the product, okay? Be careful because for some reason, test writers like to do this to you. They just like to switch that arrow. And then they'll say, which of the following items are products? Is it Y, Z, or W? Well, Y is a product because the arrow is pointing to it. Okay, so this time the reactants are on this side and the products are on this side, but the arrow is still, as always, pointing to the products. Okay, so be very careful with that. They like to trick you. So let's remind ourselves, what does the cell use for energy? And we've been briefly introduced to this chemical, ATP. Its big name is adenosine triphosphate, but it is always referred to as ATP. Its building blocks are adenine, which is actually an amino acid, ribose, ends in ose, so that makes it a what? That's a sugar ring. And then it has 3 phosphate groups. 1, 2, 3. That's where the T comes from. Triphosphate. 3 phosphates. ATP is like a fully charged battery. It has tons of energy inside of it. Where is all of that energy stored? It's stored right here in between phosphate number 2 and phosphate number 3. This bond, when it is broken, releases a huge amount of energy that the cell can use to either build a protein, move one of those transport proteins to open up and let something in, or one of those proteins that walk along the cytoskeleton. It can power one of those, whatever it needs. But that's where the energy is stored, right there in that bond between phosphate number 2 and phosphate number 3. That's where all the energy is. Okay. Now we can think of ATP like a battery. Once you use the energy in it, it's a dead battery. But you can recharge that battery by plugging it into the mitochondria. Okay, so just like you would plug in your phone to the wall or to your computer to charge it, we're going to plug in a dead battery to a mitochondria. Now, a dead battery has a slightly different name. Okay, it's called a DP, because what happens when you break that bond between phosphates 2 and 3, you're releasing the energy. You're killing the battery. And when you break that bond, well, now you don't have 3 phosphates anymore. So now you can't call it a triphosphate because now there's only 2 phosphates. And what is one of the prefixes for 2? Hopefully you said di, because now it's adenosine diphosphate, ADP. So D for dead battery. Okay, we've taken all the energy out. It doesn't have any energy. It's a dead battery. But we take ADP, this dead battery, send it over to the mitochondria. The mitochondria recharges it by slapping another phosphate onto it, putting it back into ATP. Then the cell uses it again, turns it into ADP. It's a dead battery. Send it back to the mitochondria, charge it up to ATP, and over and over and over again. Okay, so these molecules are reusable. They're part of a little mini cycle. So we're going to talk about photosynthesis first. So let's remind ourselves, what organelle is responsible for carrying out photosynthesis? The chloroplast. It's its job. Where do you find chloroplasts? You find them in plants. But where in plants? Only in the green parts. They're in the leaves, in the parts that have access to the sun. So what does a chloroplast look like? Well, earlier we always looked at them and we said, you know, it's a chloroplast because A, it's green, chloro, and B, it has little circles inside of it. Well, now we're going to look at this stuff a little bit more in depth, and I'll go ahead and warn you, you need to be able to label a chloroplast. You will be asked to do it again soon. So there's 5 major parts of the chloroplast you need to know. First is the stroma. The stroma is a thick fluid inside the chloroplast. It's kind of like the cytoplasm, but just inside the chloroplast. It's that really thick, viscous, sticky fluid that keeps all the other parts floating. So it's kind of like cytoplasm, but it's just for the chloroplast. That's the stroma. So that's going to be all the empty space represented inside of a chloroplast. That's going to be your stroma. Then you have your thylakoid. A thylakoid is a sac-like membrane inside of the chloroplast. So when we drew all those little circles inside of our chloroplast, each circle we were drawing was a thylakoid. Okay, so one little circle is a thylakoid. Now, if you take a whole bunch of thylakoids and you stack them all together, you create a granum. So a granum is simply a stack of thylakoids. Now, a chloroplast is one of those special membrane-bound organelles, those fancy organelles. And so they have 2 membranes, 2 layers. So they have an outer membrane and they have an inner membrane. Okay? So those are the 5 parts of a chloroplast that you need to know. Make sure you can label one of these. So what does photosynthesis do? Photosynthesis takes light energy in the form of light, a type of energy that we as animals cannot use, and it converts it, it changes it into chemical energy. Now, chemical energy is a form of energy animals can use, and it's going to require the use of chlorophyll. Remember, chlorophyll is a pigment. It's a pigment that looks green, and it is the best pigment for doing photosynthesis. So now we need to understand how light works before we can really understand photosynthesis. So light is energy. Energy travels in waves, up and down as it travels. Now, our eyes can detect the level of that energy. And what our eyes do for us is it interprets the level of energy as colors. Okay, so how much energy is in light is based on its wavelength. It's traveling in a wave. If it's traveling in a very slow, long wave, then it's very low energy. But if it's traveling in a very tight, fast wave, it's high energy. And our eyes are going to reflect that a different way for us. It's going to convert it into colors. So make sure that you know that if something looks white, all colors are being reflected off of it. So it's not absorbing any energy. So what we see is what's bouncing back to us. So the sun or the lights in the room give off all the colors of the rainbow, and it hits all the objects and then bounces off of those objects. What bounces off hits our eyes and is what we see. So if you see white, that means it's reflecting all the colors of the rainbow, and it's all the colors mixed together. If something looks black, then all the colors are actually being absorbed. And so black is actually the absence of light because nothing is bouncing to your eye. And so your eye interprets it as black. Now, if something looks red, that means that it is absorbing all the colors except for red. So it's absorbing all the blue light, all the green light, all the purple light, and it's bouncing back red light. Make sure that if I ask you a question of what is bouncing off or what is being absorbed, you can answer it. If you don't quite understand this right now, call me over and let me give you some more examples and explain it to you. Make sure you understand how color works. So here's our visible spectrum. Hopefully you guys know Roy G. Biv, which is the color based on energy. So red is the lowest energy, and as you work your way up, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, violet is the highest energy. And I'm going to stop today by giving you these important chemical compounds. Make sure that you can match the chemical compound to the name. H2O is water, CO2 carbon dioxide, etc.